Hey guys, so this is something I've wanted to do for a while, and that is looking at the past performance history of some of the top decks in the last year. So if you follow my channel, you'll know that I do these monthly tier lists based on Dueling Book data from YUGIOH, and so using that data I've collected over the past year, I wanted to map out some of the top decks' win percentages and how often they were played in the last year, and provide some narrative behind them as well as part of a blast of the past. And before we continue, a big thanks to my sponsors as always. Links and discount codes for Yu-Gi-Oh supplies in the description below. So let's cover the highest win percentage ever recorded since February 2022 by these 13 decks that I've chosen, and I get that this graph is not the prettiest to look at, but I tried fitting in as many decks as I can. Now it looks like Flunder actually narrowed out with the highest win percentage, and there's several decks that have reached the 60% match win mark, which is very high. We do have some older decks like Drytron, Tri-Brigade, and Dogmatika Invoked, where even a year ago they were sort of tier 2 decks at best. Now obviously if I had more data and could go back even farther in time, that would be ideal, but unfortunately I only started collecting the DB data in detail since last year, so that's why February 2022 is the farthest I can go back. I think it's interesting to see that while Tears and Spright are definitely strong, you still have some other decks like Prank Kids or Virtual World that still held their own in their respective time frames. Now if you were to look at the worst match win percentage recorded in the past year for these same decks, you see that decks like Flunder, Tears, and Spright are still pretty solid with around 55% as their worst, but then you have some older decks like Drytron and Dogmatika Invoked who have really struggled, performing at around the 30% at their worst. For Prank Kids, while their minimum win percentage was 59%, don't let this confuse you because technically it's more so 0 because the deck is just flat out not played anymore, but we'll get to that later in the video. Now what this graph is basically showing is that among all matches that were played on Dueling Book in a given month in the past year, how much of the total matches played was by a specific deck. In other words, it's a measure of how often the deck was actually played. Now you see that at one point in the past year, Branded was played as much as a third of all matches that were played online. This is a little misleading though because it's not specific to Branded Despia, as YUGIOH does have some limitations and this is just any deck that played the Branded package. So right after the structure deck release, of course a lot of different decks were trying out Branded Fusion, hence why they were played so much. As much as we know Tearlaments are tier 0, at least online, at most it took about 26% of matches among all decks, which is still a very high number of course. And then you have some other decks like Dragon Link or Prank Kids where even in their prime, they were not actually played as dominantly as we've seen with some of the decks right now like Spright or Tears. And lastly, you of course have again some of the older favorites like Drytron and Dogmatika Invoked that just has not seen that much play in the past year. So let's try to cover each deck in more detail, starting with Dragon Link. Now, not too surprisingly, Dragon Link has been very consistent in the last year, except for in October when it took a bit of a beating in win percentage, presumably after that ban list hitting Halcyon Chaos Ruler, two integral pieces of the deck. But all in all, it seems to be hovering around 50%, although next format might be a little tougher for them considering that the Kashtira matchup, that banishes everything. Then this again shows how often the deck was played relative to other decks, and looks like the popularity has certainly died down since early last year, which again is understandable because after the several indirect hits on the ban list, Dragon Link is definitely not in the best spot as it once was. If you could go farther back than February of 2022, Dragon Link definitely held the tier 1 spot for quite some time, with its best iteration in recent memory being when you could Buster Lock so that your opponent could not access the extra deck while ripping a card out of your opponent's hand with Levianeer just to make things even worse. Now, Dogmatika Invoked was past its tier 1 status even by last February, but early on it was at least still a solid consistent choice as it always had been. I even played Invoked Eldlich to some success until Power of the Elements came out, and as you can see by the win percentages, the deck has definitely struggled over time and cannot even crack the 40% win mark anymore. In terms of how often it's played in the last year, basically has gone to essentially no play at all. If you could go back a couple of years, the Invoke package first returned to meta relevancy when the Shaddoll structure deck came out and became an instant tier 1 strategy, and then once the pandemic hit, the deck sorta disappeared for a while during Eldlich and Emancipator format, only to return to tier 1 status yet again as Dogmatika Invoked, as Window was pretty dang strong at the time and this deck could also play a lot of hand traps. Next we have Tri-Brigade, which was rather consistent early last year but fell off a bit since the release of Power of the Elements, although it did climb back up to the 50% win percent range, until recently it's fallen again. The introduction of Spright meant Tri-Brigade Spright was the best variant, and that's probably where the bounce back in win percentage happened. Sadly, its win percentage will probably dip even more next format as Kashtira will banish everything and Tri-Brigade does record their grave. As for how often it was played, still played a decent amount at least for a deck that's long past its tier 1 status. The deck was in its prime in the summer of 2021 where it was insanely consistent, but to be honest, even at that point it was considered a pretty fair tier 1 deck. The end board was not too oppressive as it was often something like Appaloosa and Dragon Lord and Revolt, but its grind game was strong and its consistency was one of the best. The deck also evolved to become a combo variant with the help of Literalist cards, although that did not last too long thanks to the ban list hitting Recital Starling and the Simorglink. And then we have Drytron, where while by February of last year it was also not really a tier 1 deck, it was still performing very well and only recently just sort of tanked. The high win percentage as of February of this year is because it's based on a really small sample size, so keep that in mind. Similar to Tri-Brigade, this was also in tier 1 in summer of 2021 and even before that as well, being incredibly strong when it went first, as you basically had Herald of Perfection for recurring negates as well as the recurring orange lights thanks to Eva. The deck is definitely not played much at all anymore now that the Bestials and Ishizu Grave Shufflers completely destroy their game plan. It was cool to see a ritual archetype be meta relevant again, although to be honest it was not a fun deck to play against as it had so much gas and was almost impossible to play through if you could not prevent their setup. Next we have Prank Kids, which was tier 1 earlier last year, especially thanks to the Adventure Token engine, and with Meow Meow Mew the deck was insanely consistent, performed really well until that ban list that banned the Link 1, which made Prank Kids really inconsistent and relying on hard opening your fusion plays. It's crazy that the deck sees absolutely no play at all, and now it is possible that it's played in really small amounts, but for each month I collected the top 100 decks played, so it would have to have been beyond that. Any of their Prank Kids main deck monster was full combo for this deck in its prime, and Pac notably won the remote YCS with this deck. I do feel bad for Prank Kids enthusiasts to lose their Link 1 so quickly after finally getting one, but I do think that it can return one day once the Adventure Token engine gets hit a little. Next we have Virtual World, which has actually been pretty darn consistent in its win percentage even now, with the dip in August being when Power the Elements released, so maybe they had some initial trouble against Spright and Tearlaments until they figured it out. The deck's win percentage will likely struggle next format though, because again, it's another deck that requires the grave heavily, like most strategies, and Kashtira just says no to that. In terms of play, definitely not played as much as last year, but still encouraging to see that despite the initial dip in play after Power of the Elements, its popularity picked back up again as a Rogue and Synchro XC strategy. Now this deck was tier 1 starting out 2021 because VFD was just so insanely strong and did not let opponents play. That was definitely not a fun format, and surprising that VFD lasted as long as it did, but once it got banned, Virtual World has not been tier 1 since, but has definitely been around the tier 2 mark here and there. Then we have one of the more newer decks, and that is Swordsoul. It's always been touted as a very consistent deck, and as you can tell by its win percentage in the last year, that's definitely the case, except for again, at the release of Power of the Elements. A really solid deck even now, and perhaps can put up a fight against Kashtira better than some of the decks I've listed so far. As for its popularity, it was a pretty interesting case because before Power of the Elements release, it was by far considered the best deck of the format, and even without a ban list dropping, it immediately dropped in popularity and play thanks to the release of Spright and Tearlaments, the new best decks in town. To be fair, Swordsoul's popularity has risen since the beginning of this year it seems, and looks like a lot of people really enjoy this deck and are definitely still topping YCS events here and there with it, and definitely regionals. While it no longer has a toxic win condition in Arch Nemesis Proto to lock your opponents out of effects, it's definitely a very fair and consistent strategy and is a good choice to run if you're not looking to play tier 1 decks. So with the release of the Alba structure deck, Branded exploded onto the scene, and as mentioned at the beginning of the video, I did note that this is not specific to Branded Despia because of YUGIOH scope data quality issues, but any deck that played the Branded package. So the win percentage for Branded Despia in particular was probably a bit higher than what you see here, but one thing is for sure, the deck is pretty damn consistent. It won YCS events right from the gate and is only about to get much better after Cyberstorm Access. In terms of popularity, when the Alba structure decks first became legal, I think everyone was trying to just slap Branded Fusion onto whatever deck they were playing, so the play was absurdly high at 31% of the matches being Branded variants, but has definitely dropped off since. Another solid tier 2 choice for the last little while, similar to Swordsoul, definitely took a backseat once Tearlaments and Spright came out. And then we have Sky Striker, which of course is one of the most popular decks of all time, and while it was not tier 1 in the last year, it at least reached solid tier 2 status for a while, although its win percentage has definitely struggled nowadays since the release of Bestials and Grave Shufflers, and will only get worse next format with Kashtira in the mix. The play of Sky Strikers may have declined in the last year, but 2% of all matches being Striker is actually quite impressive, considering that its strategy is very difficult to work out right now in the format. This deck was one of the best tier 1 decks of all time in its prime, with the most YCS event wins I believe. Even after small hits, the Striker engine was played in other strategies such as Striker Orcas as a new tier 1 option back in 2019, until Engage finally got the axe, and that's when Sky Striker fell off its tier 1 status. It's a deck that Konami seems to love, so it will probably become good again at some point. Next we have Eldlich, where with the release of branded stuff earlier last year, the deck emerged again as one of the tier 1 contenders, and even before that, Cybers Eldlich PAL was another tier 1 option as well. Since then, the release of Bestials really made this deck almost unplayable, although the recent month its win percentage has climbed up, although likely because of the small sample size. Its popularity in play has definitely declined a lot in the last year and will likely only continue to go down. When Eldlich first came out when the pandemic started, it quickly evolved into Invoked Eldlich followed by Synchro Eldlich, which was one of the best decks I played against for sure. Pure Trap Eldlich was quite solid for a while, and the other iterations of Eldlich really showed how strong this package was until recently. And then we have Floowandereeze, and man is this deck consistent. Has slowly seemed to creep up in its win percentage and is consistently over 60%, which is just insane. The deck is sort of the best counter to Tearlaments at the moment, although that title will likely shift over to Kashtira very soon. Interestingly enough, despite how strong it is, definitely not a deck that's played often by players on DB, at least compared to some of the other top tier decks right now. It does get some flack for being a boring deck, but the deck definitely has some really heavy hitters in Shifter, Featherstorm, and Windberry Statue to get you some easy wins. When this deck originally came out, it suffered a lot of bricking issues, but that was largely fixed thanks to the release of Advent, although the deck still does have some consistency issues. Next we have Spright, where after the release of Power the Elements, this deck just came out hitting and has done very well since. It's an incredibly consistent deck that's already topped numerous YCS events and regionals, and despite the Tier 0 format, has still considerably gotten some tops even now. Now in terms of play, early on when the deck was released, there were some data quality issues on YUGIOH scope where it could not identify this deck properly, but since then, the last few months, it's really seen a tremendous amount of play and essentially accounted for 1/5 of all matches being played on Dueling Book right now. So far, it's only gotten an indirect hit in Ronin Totem, which was immediately resolved thanks to the release of Sprint, and it's probably time to get another hit to the deck, as much as I love playing Spright myself. And finally, we end off with Tearlaments, which like Spright had immediate success, but unlike Spright, experienced much better support with the release of subsequent sets in Darkwing Blast and Magnificent Mavens, which has catapulted them into Tier 0 status since November. The deck is full of gas and can basically do anything, but it certainly is hard to pilot and is bound to meet its match when Kashtira releases and Photon Hypernova. As for popularity, similar to Spright, YUGIOH scope could not properly identify this deck early on, but now that's solved and the deck essentially makes up about a quarter of all matches being played on DB right now. It's the most represented deck in YCS top cuts by far, and likely requires some more big hits on the next list, as it got a small slap on the wrist with the last one, hitting orange light instead of any tier cards. One of the best decks to ever grace the game, and it looks like it will be very strong for more months to come, regardless of whatever hits it gets, as seen in the OCG. Alright guys, so that was a summary of some of the top decks in the past year based on data. Let me know if you enjoyed this and I can make it periodically. As always, a big thanks to my Patreons, Eileen Dice Queen, Bolt Spider, Cybernetic, Brandon Jaren, Barrel Lord, Spooky Boogie, Stephen Phillips, and Chaz Banks as always for supporting the channel. You guys are awesome. If you're interested in joining my Patreon, link down below. Take care guys.